Hello and welcome to the Lively Faith Podcast. I am your host, the Reverend Nathan Stomberg, Rector of Holy Communion Anglican Church in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. And today I'm joined by the Reverend Mark Galloway, Presbyter at Holy Communion, and we're also joined by Cory DuPont, Subdeacon at St. Mary Antiochian Orthodox Church in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. So today we've got a lot of good stuff to talk about. We're going to be talking about the Great Tradition. We'll be discussing the passing of Pope Benedict XVI. And let's go ahead and jump right in. Cory, it's nice to have you back with us.
Thank
you were
you.
Studying for some exams, right? How
Yes.
did those go?
You flunked? Very well, thankfully. Yes.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. So, Mark, do you have any sarcastic comments to add before we
Yeah,
get
I'm
started?
surprised he passed.
As we all are.
Me too.
So one of the things that we've talked about a lot over the last few episodes is the Great Tradition. We've referred to it, but we haven't really spent much time exploring what it is we mean when we talk about the Great Tradition. And the Great Tradition is at the heart of what we discuss in this podcast, Lively Faith. We've got scripture and tradition at our side, and I think we like to place the emphasis on the tradition, right? Because we're more than just sola scriptura. We also affirm the authority of historic church tradition as well. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to offer what I would say is my own simple definition of the Great Tradition, and then feel free to jump in there with whatever you'd like to add. So I would call the Great Tradition the historic, ordered, liturgical, sacramental worship of the universal church. And so referring to the liturgy is the vehicle of the Great Tradition. And it takes different forms between East and West, Orthodoxy and Roman Catholic or Anglican traditions. And the Great Tradition always affirms Orthodox beliefs as set forth in the Nicene creeds and God's grace received in the sacraments of baptism and the Holy Eucharist. So it's really those pillars of the Great Tradition that really make it what it is. And if you deviate from those things and you stray off into heresy, then even though you may look like a church of the Great Tradition, you really don't belong to that anymore.
Well, it's interesting, to ask the question what it is, because looking at the history of how that's been used, which is short, right? I mean, academically, historically speaking, half a century, maybe, right? This is being used first in academic circles, and then it comes out into the churches. It starts as a mainline Protestant effort to reappropriate much of which had believed to have been lost, and then after Vatican II, you start to see, an openness on the part of Roman Catholics to be in more conversation with Protestants and Protestantism, which has produced some good things, and sometimes it may have gone too far or maybe not far enough. But it was initially first a conversation between Protestants and Catholics, right? And Orthodox are over here primarily because of geography, right? So that they frequently don't factor into the conversation. And so what happens is when they get into the conversation, there's already a preconditioned set of terms, right? And so it's either these are the terms we use, do what you will with them, find where you are in the conversation, and then let's go from there. Which is why, even now, today, an insistence upon or presumption of a great tradition, Orthodox probably more than Catholics even, would treat it with a certain measure of skepticism, right? Now I, having once been, a mainline Protestant and then becoming Orthodox, I can certainly work my way into that conversation, knowing the terms and the history behind it. But I'm also thinking of the majority of Orthodox who, they don't know what that means.
Right.
They don't know what
Yeah.
these questions are.
They-
They don't know what these problems and challenges are, right? Many Orthodox, even the best informed, the best theologically educated would say, well, you're really dealing with questions and challenges that are unique to Western Christianity, right? This is a Catholic Protestant issue, right? We don't have those questions or challenges per se. We can certainly make contributions to the conversation, right, from our own unique perspective. For example, defining what tradition is, what is the relationship between tradition and liturgy, what is the relationship between the interpretation of Scripture, which Orthodox believe is the Church's book, and how we do liturgy, how we understand tradition as it is passed on. Does it change? Does it evolve? Does it develop? These are questions that Orthodox themselves already have a certain set of answers to, right? Where, just as Roman Catholics and Protestants do as well. But the benefit for Roman Catholics and Protestants when they talk about the great tradition is that they're already speaking a common language, right? And not just metaphorically speaking, but even quite literally speaking, right? I mean, the Latin language is the root, right, of even Protestantism, even if many Protestants today have lost sight of that, right?
Yeah.
But Protestantism is an extension, really, of Catholicism. Whether it's perceived to have been set apart or broken off from it, it's still very much, that's its identity, that's its genesis, right? It still wrestles with the theological questions of Latin Christianity, right? So when you bring all three together, then you have a different conversation about what the great tradition is, and what each one can contribute to that conversation. And a lot of Orthodox, would be perhaps slightly opposed to it because it goes against their own presumptions about what the church is and what the nature of the church is, right? But there's no reason why you can't have a conversation and right and friendship and charity and right and just talk about things, right? You don't have to sacrifice identity or presumptions about this or that to come together and talk about, well, what is the great tradition? What does it mean to focus on this first 1,000 years of undivided Christianity, right? And what was the role of liturgy and the interpretation of Scripture within those first 1,000 years? How did we deal with problems within those first 1,000 years, right? So it's a definition in progress, at least from the Orthodox position, I would say, right? And again, because a little late to the game, we still try to find our footing in these conversations, right? Whereas when Catholics and Protestants have already been having this conversation for quite a while, right? There never really was a complete separation between Catholicism and Protestantism in the sense that they stopped talking to one another, right? There was always pretty much, for the most part, an interaction.
Well, it was certainly interaction.
Yeah, interaction, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes violent, sometimes hostile, sometimes pejorative, but there's interaction. There's an acknowledgement there that they both exist. Sometimes Eastern Christians, well, people forget that they exist, right? And so when they come into the conversation, it's like, oh, well, that's interesting that you have that position. Okay, yeah, all right, let's talk about that, right? So it's an open book, I think. But it's an interesting conversation to have, right? So.
Yeah, I think and before I give you the chance to speak, Mark, I think it's unique, especially for us in the position of this podcast, because we are trying to thread a needle that I don't think many people are trying to thread, being able to discuss issues with Christian worldview implications so that a wide audience can appreciate them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Cory's statements are extremely helpful. I would start out, like if I was teaching this as a course to whoever, I would make the distinction between tradition with a capital T and tradition with a small t. So when we're talking about the great tradition, we're talking about a big T, right? So the ultimate big T for the great tradition is the Scriptures themselves. It is the tradition of the church, right? And then I was listening to a Lutheran pastor, Cory. I don't know when he taped this. I think it was sometime in 2022, but and I'm assuming he was from a conservative, maybe the Wisconsin Synod or the Missouri Synod, just based on what he was saying, because I can't imagine the ELCA guy would say this. But basically he was saying, is Orthodoxy really Christianity? Is it part of apostolic tradition? And how ignorant this guy was driving me mad, right? And he's like us, he's in his clerical collar, and he's talking about why Lutheranism is the de facto representative of apostolic continuity in the West. Specifically Lutheranism.
Right.
And you know this from
Yeah.
your own studies and
Yeah.
some quasi-involvement in Lutheranism.
Sure.
But his ignorance about Orthodoxy was stunning.
Right.
Just stunning to me. And he says, the Orthodox don't define anything like we do in the West. I go, no, I'm thinking, no kidding. There was no need to define all those things in the East, in the sense of the Western scholastic tradition, because there wasn't a scholastic tradition.
Right,
And then it didn't go through the Reformation, where every jot and tittle in the Book of Concord and the Westminster Confession defined everything that the Church never defined.
Yeah.
Right? And so he doesn't even understand tradition.
Right.
And he doesn't even understand the history. And for him, it's just regurgitating Lutheran apologetics about why we're the de facto continuity in the West of the great tradition. I would say, in a general sense, Anglicanism is, and I would speak of the great tradition, would involve several things. It would involve the scriptures, from using Anglican language, is the ultimate standard of the Christian faith, right? And nothing that is not found in there explicitly being taught for salvation, which is not sola scriptura. It's a different angle that Anglicanism takes on the role of Scripture, and they certainly would recognize it's the Church's book. And as we spoke about in our last broadcast about the chicken and the egg conversation. So Scriptures, sacraments, creed, ministry. This is a four-legged stool to tradition that is shared by the undivided church, right? And the ministry involves specific things, specific orders that do specific things in the ordained ranks. And then, depending on an Orthodox perspective, a Catholic perspective, and quasi, to some extent, Anglican, then Lutherans, then it's the teaching authority of the church, the role of ecumenical councils, and so forth. That's all part of the great tradition, right? I'd argue that I would agree with you that the mainline churches are birthed out of Latin Christianity, and there's been this struggle going on, and certainly dialogue and at least contact amongst the mainline Protestant traditions, right? Lutheranism, Anglicanism, the Reform movement. But I would argue modern evangelicalism in the West, as in American non-denominationalism, has nothing to do with that. It's not rooted in anything
Right.
based on what we're talking about here, right? Because they don't have sacraments, the Zwinglian non-denominationalists, and they don't really have ordained ministry, right? Not because it's not efficacious, because they really don't have sacraments.
Yeah.
So you don't have sacramental ministry.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the great tradition, we're talking about this continuity of those legs to this stool that are present. And so an interesting piece is that the Orthodox in North America were speaking to the Anglicans ever before they started speaking to Rome,
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
right?
Right.
Because there was more touchstones about the nature of Anglican communion in the world looked somewhat like the autocephalous arrangement within Orthodoxy and so forth. So again, this can be a very difficult conversation to have when we're talking with some evangelical brothers, that because there's not a lot of people who really care about the great tradition left in the main line. Just, is there? There really isn't. So
And I think that's where the conversation gets interesting, challenging maybe, where I know of evangelicals who are, I think, now being drawn back into a fascination with
Yes.
historic Christian tradition.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious what you would say to a person who belongs to an evangelical church, maybe someone who's
Like a free church?
like a free church, or essentially worships as a Baptist, let's say, like a church that there's a church that I visited a few weeks ago, which was a Baptist church, but they made a point of reciting the Nicene Creed, kind of at the start of this service. But you can tell that there is I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that there is still an understanding that that's what they should be striving for. How do we charitably speak to such people?
Well, it's interesting, when you mentioned that to me at Holy Eucharist last week, and we were talking about it, and then you kind of told me how the translation of the creed was. It was more of an interpretation. And you'll appreciate this, Cory. They basically edited out homoousios, because it's not biblical, of course, right?
Goodness.
Right? So they create a nomenclature that gets them around this, but there is this need to feel connected
Yes.
to the historic church, even though they're missing the whole point
Right.
by editing out the whole.
Yeah.
That's what defended the church against Arianism, that term. But they're actually avoiding the term that makes the Nicene Creed the most important document of the
Yeah.
early church. So there's this irony to that at the same time.
Yeah.
But there's a weird unawareness of what's central to the tradition.
Right. It's been a while since I've had those conversations. I mean, my contact with and even awareness of what is going on in mainstream American evangelicalism is very nil at this point. But the few times I have been able to have these conversations, it's interesting. You know, first they're fascinated. Right, it's like, oh, you're from that. Oh, wow, that's interesting. I've heard of it, but I don't know a lot about it. You know, and yeah, we're trying to do things here where we want to start fasting, and we want to have more intentional communities.
We want to celebrate Advent and Lent.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, okay, so I said by intentional communities you mean monasteries, essentially, right? Well, no, like not monasteries. Like, no, monasteries. That's essentially what you mean. But they're divorced from that, right? But they're also divorced from it historically,
Yes.
right? They don't, right? It's Newman's old adage, right? To be steeped in history, right, is to no longer be a Protestant.
No.
Right? And so, and I think that's characteristic primarily of evangelicals today, right? A complete divorce from history means, despite your best efforts, you're
And
just...
sincerity.
And sincerity,
Yeah.
sure,
Right.
sure, without question. You're just playing at this. And which, of course, opens you up to dangers when you're doing this set apart from an authority and so on, right, a tradition.
A hierarchy.
Or hierarchy, but that's a cultural problem at large in the West, right? We don't like hierarchy, we don't like patriarchy, we don't like any of these things
Yeah.
at this point. So, and there's a movement within American evangelicalism to be more egalitarian, right? And I saw this even years ago, and as I go in Cornwall, the conversation was shifting from male headship in churches to egalitarian forms of ministry in the churches, right? And thinking, good luck with that.
Right.
So,
It didn't work for the main line.
no, it didn't. And it's not going to work for evangelicals either.
No. All that bailing on the sex issue left and right.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they have the freedom to do that because there's nothing restraining them.
No, just the
Right.
local pastor.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And if the local pastor does not join the fray, then you just fire him, you get rid of him, and you bring in someone hipper and more cool.
Yeah.
So,
You're so right about, Newman's assessment, right? Obviously, his conversion, he writes Pro Vita Sua,
Right.
but it's true. Now, we would speak of a wider breadth to Catholicism than he's speaking, even the Orthodox.
yeah.
Wouldn't exclude themselves from his definition. He wouldn't exclude the Orthodox either, but Anglicanism, being the hybrid it is, even, when Henry VIII suppressed the monasteries, the Benedictine spirit never left Anglicanism, right? And so it remained the most incarnational of all the Protestant traditions, and almost inevitably gave rebirth to monastic orders. right? Just because of the nature, it's this incarnational sacramental system, and so after a few centuries, it's this rebirth to seeing, which can happen in Lutheranism to an extent. I wouldn't say Thèse is really representative of that, but Thèse is a community in France. It's an ecumenical. I'll leave it alone. Monastery.
Inside joke.
left avoided.
Yeah. The tradition, though, to be fair, right? So for Anglicanism's tradition is truncated. We've talked about this, and so in Orthodoxy to an extent too. And I don't want to speak authoritatively about Orthodoxy, but when the Church divides in 1054, now there's only X amount of councils, right? Now, the Latin Catholic Church would say all these councils through Vatican II are ecumenical, right? So they continue to address issues, right? It's 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
There's a lot of issues that the Church Universal needs to address, right? And so, and Anglicanism, in theory, goes through like the Seventh Council, if you read the Book of Homilies or something like that, and but really emphasizes the first four, which only gets us to 451, right? So it's a truncated view of tradition that we have to wrestle with in the true traditions, because unlike the Latin Catholic Church, which has continued to meet and define. I mean, as far as I know, the last time Orthodoxy met in what they would consider was 1672, I think, right?
No, there were a few meetings after that, but not of great significance.
Right. It's a long time ago.
Yeah. There were other synods that had taken place, during the Middle Ages in Byzantium, but none of them carry the weight or authority or the scope of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which is the last true ecumenical council, Orthodox would argue. And I
Right.
think that is true. Because the Latin councils that follow after that, I would also argue, much like Orthodox councils that take place
Like the
after
Lateran
Lateran
Council and
I mean,
so forth.
They're dealing with administrative issues. There was the question also, too, of whether or not Christ was actually and truly present in the Eucharist and how that works, right? So we get transubstantiation from.
Right,
and,
Lateran, right.
So Orthodox would say, well, those are important, but they're not dire.
Right.
We're not dealing with Christology here, right? As far as Orthodoxy is concerned, Christology is a done deal. It's settled. That's it. There's nothing else that needs to be said in that regard, other than just to defend it at this point, right? So,
And when I think for clarification, when you're talking about Orthodoxy, you're not talking about all the Orthodox churches have unified Christology, right? If the Coptics
I'm not sure.
don't
You have the
it,
Copts, you have the Armenians, and the
right.
Ethiopians,
Right,
the
so-
non-Chalcedonians.
Right,
Yeah.
so there's another piece to that
Yeah.
conversation too. So,
Yeah.
if for Catholicism, when I talk about sacraments, ministry, creed, liturgy, the papacy is of the utmost importance as far as Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. We talk about the great tradition, obviously, right? And for Orthodoxy, it's bishops in council that
Yeah.
take place. And Anglicanism would, in theory, say that. They just don't do it in any practical way that actually amounts to anything. So,
Well, to be fair, Lambeth tries to do that,
Oh,
or used to try to do it
and
seriously. I don't know what they do now, but
right, and I think
there was a serious
I think
desire.
through 1930, I think it
Yeah.
successfully did that.
Right.
Right.
Started to go downhill after the birth control.
Yes,
issue.
in 1930, right. And so, but at least as a mechanism,
Yeah.
there is no other tradition out of the Reformation that has a universal ministry. So Anglicanism was unique. The episcopate, historic episcopate, made it. It always had a representative of the head of a diocese, so that you could speak worldwide. Protestant, mainline Protestant, can't do that.
Yeah.
It never has been able to do that. So when you're dialoguing with somebody, who are you talking with?
Yeah.
And what are you talking about?
Right.
And who do you represent?
Yeah.
Right. And so it's this, and you break that down into its most basic form in evangelical America. You're talking to a local congregation.
Yeah. Which could be a great conversation, but
Right.
you're still just talking to that local congregation.
Exactly.
That's the problem.
Right, who,
So,
and so you and I want to talk about Athanasius and Chrysostom and the Cappadocian Fathers and Augustine and Jerome, and
yeah.
it's all irrelevant.
Right. If just not unknown.
Right.
You know, that's the challenge there.
Right.
Unless they do the work themselves, right? And I've seen that when you have evangelicals, they've taken that step and they do the work and they read this or they read that, and then they come to you with the possibility for a great conversation.
Well, it's a liturgy that grabs them.
Yes.
It's liturgy, and I
Yeah.
think that the rector, that your point of bringing liturgy as a central piece, we have Ratzinger's book here, The Theology of the Liturgy, which is one of his greatest tomes, probably along with his Introduction to Christianity. I think those two books are
Very good books.
probably, in the three volumes he did on Jesus while he was Pope. We can't overemphasize the centrality of liturgy.
Right.
Liturgy drives orthodoxy with a small o in this sense, as opposed to the communion. And without liturgy, you can't have orthodoxy.
Right. I would.
Unless you pray right, you're not going to believe right.
Right.
And unless that form of liturgy is in continuity with the historic river of the church, it's just not going to work.
The liturgy is, in a sense, the embodiment of that tradition.
Yes.
Lex orandi, lex credendi.
Especially in
Praying is
Orthodox.
the law of
Actually,
believing.
especially in all three traditions, but much more so in Orthodoxy. And Anglicanism does, and it stayed homogeneous that way as long as you had a single prayer book that carried the weight of the 1662 book. But once it dispersed into all these national prayer books that could have contradict each other in the scope of its doctrine, the liturgy, which was the great thing that held Anglicanism together, started to fall apart, right?
And the
so
root of that issue is, much like with tradition, liturgy is something that you receive. It's not something
Yes.
that you invent.
Yes, right.
And that's really where
Yes.
things start to go off the rails,
Yeah.
is people get the idea and the impression that, well, I can take tradition, I can take the liturgy and turn it into whatever I want in order to suit my own needs.
Right.
But the reality is that we don't have a right to just
Right.
take liturgy
Right.
and change it to however best suits us.
Yeah, and there are essential pieces that are in liturgy that, go back, whether it's Chrysostom's liturgy, Gregory the Great's liturgy in the West, and then Cranmer's liturgy is just a reworking of the Latin Mass. But the essentials of what was in the celebration of the Eucharist going back to at least the 3rd century in its core, even to Justin Martyr.
Sure.
It has to be present to be part of this great continuity of apostolic tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you don't have any liturgy, you can't be in
Yeah.
that apostolic tradition.
Yeah, it's a free-for-all
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something that you were saying before, Mark, that the liturgy is what grabs people who are outside of these traditions, especially evangelicals. And I think we're seeing that bear out in some demographic changes where younger generations, my age and younger, are increasingly being drawn to conservative liturgical traditions, be it the Orthodox Church or conservative Roman Catholic Church, and even in a certain sense, where they can be found, conservative churches in the Anglican tradition.
Right.
Why do we think that is?
Well, I think it's the transcendence of it all. I mean, so much modern worship in the kind of American evangelical milieu is so egalitarian. It's just, it's not transcendent, and again, without an incarnational sacramental understanding of the church, how do you get to transcendence, I love the line that, in the Anglican liturgy, in Eucharist, we dwell in Christ and Christ dwells in us, right? I mean, that's the whole point
Yeah.
of worship and encountering the ascended Christ in the sacraments, who is the head of the church. And you can't get that sense of transcendence by just the personality of a pastor and without the traditional liturgy. It's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Now, Lutheranism is much like its Anglican cousin. It has segments of this, and some Lutheran traditions are much better. And with the liturgical movement of the 40s and 50s, Lutheranism re-engaged itself in its liturgical heritage. But for generations in America, most of Lutheran was just pietistic.
Yes.
It wasn't liturgically centered. And the Eucharist re-emerged in the 20th century. But if you're a cradle Lutheran today, and you were born my age, you're born in the mid-'60s, you're thinking this is what we've always done for the last 400 years, but that's it's not true, right?
Right.
There's no Book of Common Prayer in the Lutheran tradition. And so,
They have a service book that's pretty malleable.
yeah, the new one's good, but from Lutheran, Lutherans never had uniform liturgy. It was all broke up into all kinds of manners, and even the Lutheran, they continue to call it the Mass, but it was simply just the institution, words of institution. That's all there was to it. And Agnus Dei thrown in there, and boom, and then you distribute the elements. So Anglicanism always had a much fuller liturgy, and all of those things. So, but Lutheranism, I'm sure Lutherans listening to us are going to be going, we're part of that, man. We're part of that. As opposed to, I would argue, Presbyterianism. When Presbyterians recite the Nicene Creed, I think they do it sincerely. But, for instance, the line, we believe in one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. That means something utterly different to an Orthodox, to a Catholic,
Sure.
and to Arminian Anglicanism, right? It literally means that there's regeneration in baptism, as the prayer book says, right? Well, that's not what Presbyterians believe. So that line in and of itself gets unmoored from its patristic root, right? And so it's a reinterpretation of what the line means, even though you're reciting it. But you're not reciting it with the same theological understanding or conviction that was being recited since 381 when it was added to the creed.
Yeah.
So there's all of these things about tradition, and again, without knowledge, history, acumen, we can gather and talk to each other, but it's like hitting a ping pong ball past each other,
Yeah.
right? Because history matters.
Right.
There's a generational element to it too, and I'm interested to see if you both have noticed the same, that it's definitely younger people,
Oh, yes.
millennials,
Yes.
Gen Z,
Yep.
who are increasingly drawn to the conservative historical liturgical traditions. And I think it's in large part to what you were saying, Mark, where there's mystery to it. There is a call to the transcendence that you just don't get with a low church, free church
Right.
style of worship. And for someone my age, we've been steeped in a culture of scientism, of really taking things apart until you're describing it in its simplest, most meaningless terms.
Yes.
I'm sure you've heard this. This is like the classic Neil deGrasse Tyson, oh, well, you have this thing that's super important, but, it's actually just a collection of atoms and electrons and chemicals floating around. You're just a sack of chemicals, so why are you even doing this in the first place? And I think people are getting tired of that,
They are,
especially when even churches kind of fall into the same trap of abandoning that which is transcendent to focus more on the mundane, as it were, the music and the production value of a worship service in order to try and manipulate emotion to fill the void of what was left when you took out the transcendent.
Yes.
Yeah, but you remember this, Cory. You'll know of it from your studies. Robinson,
Yes.
God is dead,
Yes.
right?
Honest to God.
Early 60s, honest
Yes,
to God, early
honest to God,
60s.
right. Right.
Church of England bishop,
Yep.
total loon.
Yep.
God is dead, right?
Bishop Pike.
The reason why I think, we're talking millennials, Zers, what are the other ones?
I think those are the
So what-
two.
Okay.
Z.
Z.
Yeah,
the little
my
ones.
alphabet's all messed up on that.
That's all right. Alphabets are all over the place today.
The reason why the great tradition is so appetizing to them is because they have grown up, if they have churched, they have grown up in church where God is dead. God has been killed,
Yes.
right? So there's environmentalism, there's social justice, there's all this other stuff that
Replacements.
has nothing to do with the gospel,
Right.
right? And so it's displaced the transcendent God, right? I love Benedict and his volume on the infancy narratives talks about, he ends by saying, you know, God, Jesus is perfectly human, perfectly divine, right? As Chalcedon said in 451, he goes, do we understand it? He goes, no, you can't, right? That's the mystery, right? God's totally other, right? God's omniscient and sovereign over his creation, right? And he existed long, infinitely before creation. Creation's going to go out of existence someday, and God will still be God, right? That's transcendence. That's the mystery. It gives meaning to a Gen Zer's life, as opposed to every day they go through the same routine and they're following how shallow, right? You can listen to rock and roll, smoke some pot, have some sex, but you know what? You're an empty vessel, right? And every human being gets to that point where they get to decide, does my life have meaning? And without transcendence, your life can have no meaning.
Yeah. We've seen quite an uptick in young men coming to church. Single young men, for a host of reasons, I would imagine, but one of them is obviously the fact that the culture is leaving them behind. It's telling them that they're useless. It's telling them that they're what's wrong with the world, right? They have become emasculated, overly feminized, and the attraction, I think, is obvious. Liturgy gives them form, right? Liturgy gives them something that has a telos to it, right? It's a point to it.
Right.
And patriarchy, right? They're looking for that. They're looking for hierarchy, right? And even churches outside of the Orthodox Church that could give that, they've given up on that.
Absolutely.
Right? They're not patriarchal anymore. They're not hierarchical. Well, they are hierarchical, at least in appearance, but they don't function like a proper hierarchy, right? And
No persona Christi.
no, there's none of that, right? And I say this, with as much as humility as I can muster, I guess. But even Catholicism, which at one point did offer all this, right, has become so overly effeminized, right? It's a very effeminate church. And I just don't mean that because of the facile questions about celibacy, and to what degree homosexuality plays a role in the higher up there. But even I would argue from an Orthodox position that when you focus too much on Mariology and you don't subordinate it to Christology, then you're going to get a church that's overly effeminate and focuses too much on the feminine and not enough on the fatherhood of God.
Yeah,
Right? So
you're right, and it's interesting. When you turn the glass around, the Reformation gutted the church of femininity.
right,
Right? And so the equilibrium got lost in the other direction.
yes,
Right? And that's why you have such an imbalance in Protestantism at the same time. Now it's went all the way to femininity.
yes,
Right? Because and against Anglicanism kept enough of it where it had a better balance to it. Like the Virgin Mary wasn't thrown totally out the window.
Yeah.
It was still Marian feast days and so forth. But I agree, and it's not an easy conversation to have with
Yeah.
devout Catholics.
right. Because it's
About-
not something they can accept or deal with. But intuitively, they know it's a problem.
Yes, and Vatican II, purposely stayed away from the mediatrix,
Yes,
right?
right,
But rad-trads push it constantly,
yeah,
right? So in Orthodox, he's never going to touch that,
no,
right? And Orthodox Anglicans shouldn't either, whatever's left of us, right? So I think your point's well taken. It's like,
Yeah.
again, if you go back to the patristic model, you would see this equilibrium,
sure,
right? And that's what happens with division, though, doesn't it? Once the church divides, its initial division, then it's a trillion divisions after 15, 17.
yeah,
You're not going to have a give and take conversation that leads by the Holy Spirit to truth about Mary's role in the economy of salvation,
yeah, right.
right?
Yeah, I think those are great points.
And so Orthodoxy doesn't take umbrage in the sense of the Immaculate Conception. There are, I never can quite figure out totally what Orthodoxy's position on that is, but it's
On the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption?
the Immaculate Conception, in a sense, it's there, but it's not dogma, and it can't be.
No, you mean the Assumption.
Well,
The
even
Assumption. Immaculate Conception, Orthodox don't believe the Immaculate Conception.
I know, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, and the Assumption's another one, right? It wouldn't be dogmatized. It would
Right,
be,
yeah.
It would be part of the tradition of the church. Maybe not with a big T, I don't know.
Yeah.
But, so, but this is what happens when you have division, right? And we have a lot of division.
We do, and I think these issues will be clarified as the world, and the Western world in particular, become more hostile
Yes.
to traditional Christianity, where on the one hand, some of the things which divide us will at least be put off to the wayside, if not at least put on hold, because it'll be much more important for us to have these charitable conversations in order to unite with other Christians who either affirm or aspire to the great tradition, so that we can advance the cause of the gospel and defend
Yeah.
the faith to the Western world.
What's so painful for me about Anglicanism, Anglicanism had a vocation to be this bridge that could foster conversation, as long as it stayed Orthodox.
Right.
But when it bailed on Orthodoxy, it's just a mess, right? Because of the nature of the English Reformation, it had this ability to speak to the Orthodox, to that side of the river, to the Roman side of the river, to continental Protestantism.
Yeah.
And it gives it all up for wokeism.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been called that in 1960, but that's what it was.
Yeah, wokeism has been with us longer than just the last
Oh,
5
no, it's
years.
been
They've just
for-
renamed it,
Absolutely.
you know.
Bishop Pike.
Yeah, of course,
the
Bishop
whole
Pike,
crew.
right? I was reading, and not to go off track, but I was reading last night that David Crosby had passed away,
Yes.
right? And if you know who David
not
Crosby
familiar with
is,
him.
okay.
A prophet.
Yes, 1960s, Crosby, Stills,
Nash.
Nash, and Young.
Oh,
And the Birds.
Yep.
Yes, the
You-
Birds,
you
that's
follow the
right.
Birds.
Yep, that's right. And, well, he passed away, finally. I thought he died a while ago, actually. My wife had told me, she said, David Crosby passed away. I said, oh, from what? Had multiple children from multiple different women, even.
Total mess.
Yep. Melissa Etheridge, the famous singer, he was the sperm donor for her
Yes.
and her spouse's
Yeah, the
child.
lesbian couple. yeah,
Yes.
Yes.
So he was quite a character. But I was reading an article, it was published by the American Conservative. I can't remember who the author was. It wasn't Ratzinger, surprisingly. But they were writing about David Crosby, and it was very short, and said that really it's the 60s generation is really the beginning of all of this, right? They
Sure.
grow up, they mature a little bit, they become Clintonites, right? But they still mess up the country and the world and the culture, right? And they give birth to what we now call wokeism, really, these new generations of wayward, just lost, broken people.
80-year-old people. It reminds me of Mick Jagger, right? You're 80
Sure.
years old, you're still in your leather pants, bouncing
Yeah.
around like you're 22 years old. I'm just
I know.
like, I don't get it.
It's something
Like
else.
this maturation never took place.
Right. It didn't. Arrested development.
Right. And so,
and-
you're 80 and you're going to a Rolling Stones concert and bouncing around. And
Yeah.
it's just like,
Yeah. Yeah. He
I'm
has more-
taking you serious, right?
Right. Well, you're taking him serious as a performer, which is, one thing, but then you're taking these people seriously when they talk about things. Politics and morality and religion and the existence of God and what gender is and everything
You're
else.
right,
And
right.
it's like,
now
my
all of a
goodness.
sudden we have to take you on an authority in these
Right.
things because you're able to dance around and let dance on a stage. I want to reel us back in for a second here because we want to talk about Joseph Ratzinger next. We're going to have a lot to say about him, so it'll.
Can we break?
So what was that?
Can we break?
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, we should take a break because we're going to have a lot to say about him. I want to close this discussion by saying really the bottom line when we talk about the great tradition, why the heck should we care? It's because when churches and individuals stray from Orthodox Christianity, when we decide that we can take liberties with how we treat liturgy and tradition, that's when things go off the rails and things fall apart very fast. And I think that's going to factor into our conversations about Ratzinger. We'll take a break and then we'll be back in a few minutes.
Sounds good.
All right, we're back from break. So we were just talking about the great tradition, and we're going to transition to talking about Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, who died at the very end of 2022 on December 31st, as a matter of fact. There's a lot for us to say, so I won't waste too much more of our time. He really, well, what would you say are his greatest contributions? I'll just say it there. We'll talk about his contributions, his impact, and his legacy, if someone wants to go first.
Well, it's like a gigantic tome when you're talking about Joseph Ratzinger. And the East is going to have a perspective, or Cory's going to have a different perspective, though I think it's hard to argue the theological acumen of Joseph Ratzinger. Preparing for this, I would argue he's the greatest preacher to ever sit on the throne of Peter other than Gregory the Great. I think that's how good. And the thing about, go back to the great tradition, when we talk about preachers, we're not talking about flamboyant, charismatic people. We're talking about people who are able to transmit the gospel effectively. Like John Henry Newman was a great preacher, but if you went and listened to him, he would have bored you to death.
Yeah.
He read his sermons, right? They were written out, but historically, he's one of the great preachers in the Latin West for the last 500 years, right? That's the depth of Ratzinger, and that's just one element of him. But his actual theological competence, I don't know when you would go back to a bishop of Rome with his, maybe Leo the Great, at least as far as his influence. He wrote the Tome of Leo, which led to the Chalcedonian definition of the hypostatic union. That's how great Ratzinger is, as far as a mind. Cardinal Pell, who just died, a great man, falsely accused of sexual misconduct, spent 400 days in jail, and ironically dies a week after. Benedict said, he's just the smartest man I ever met. He says, the thing about Benedict, it wasn't like he was just smart in one area. He was smarter than you in every area. He spoke all these languages, right? He knew Greek philosophy, and he knew the East like incredible depth, and just love for the Eastern Fathers. Lancelot Andrews, he could talk to you for hours about Lancelot Andrews, the Anglican Bishop of Winchester, and just this tremendous grasp of philosophy and history. And he lived through the crap of all of the Nazism and all of this stuff. He's just, that piece of him is, he doesn't have in the West a parallel.
His intellect is always what struck me most, and I'll admit I hadn't really spent much time with him, so to speak, until the last few years when the group that I was in started reading through his work, Jesus of Nazareth, and yeah, he was just the smartest person that I've ever read at the time, and his knowledge is inexhaustible. I read so much about him after he died, so many articles that were written, and one of the things that was put up, I think, on First Things was commenting on his languages, like you said, that if you were English, when he spoke to you, was speaking in paragraphs in his fifth or sixth language, so he wasn't even using his native tongue to extol the greatness of the glories of Christ. And I think that's really what I've heard and what I've seen is the crowning achievement, as he would put it, of his ministry, that, again, with this book, that he wanted to discover and share the true nature, the person of Christ as the face of God.
Yeah, I mean, that 3-volume series on Jesus is so Ratzinger, right? Here he is. He could be the headiest guy in the world if you wanted to, but he wasn't. And for him, faith in Jesus is simple. Jesus is Lord. That's the thing about Ratzinger. It wasn't like, he didn't write books like Rowan Williams to try to tell you how smart he was, right? He wrote books because he wants to draw you to Christ. And he was a humble guy. He was egoless in many ways. He was this humble guy.
Yeah.
And he was deeply concerned about separated Christians. And two things that strike me. I remember watching this. It was Benedict who brought the relics back to Constantinople that had been taken by the Crusaders, which was a big, big deal. The Vatican had them for what, 700 years or something like that?
It was 1,000.
1,000 years. And there were conservative voices in the Curia that didn't want him to do that.
Yeah.
Tremendous act of charity, right? So he goes, the Patriarch Constantinople, who lives as a prisoner of the Turks, in this, compared to the Vatican, this little tiny place.
Yeah, Fanar is nothing impressive.
Right. And
It's nicer than my house, but,
yeah, and if you can YouTube that, there's just such a love and general sincerity to that he didn't go in there wearing a papal tiara and being triumphant, right? And then his establishment of the Anglican Ordinariate, which is the most significant piece of ecumenical accomplishment since the Reformation. But it's only he could do it. Nobody else could have pulled that off, and nobody would have had the foresight and the ability and the desire to do it. And so there won't be another Joseph Ratzinger. I just don't see it happening. I mean, and I think Francis isn't my cup of tea theologically and a whole bunch of other things sociologically. But it's an enviable task to come after. John Paul II was a great philosopher. That was his great strength. He was another guy, right? Polish. He went through the war. He survived all kinds of things. Tremendous intellect. But really, Ratzinger shadow wrote much of his own encyclicals, right? Ratzinger wrote the Catechism. I mean, John Paul gets credit for it, but Ratzinger was a level above John Paul II in the theology. Philosophically, they were probably on a par. It's hard to speak enough about this guy's acumen that way.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. You're just looking at the conversation, right? We're not Roman Catholic, right? And here we are talking about this man.
Yep.
In largely positive and
Yep.
encouraging ways. Not perfect by any means. Nobody is. But my first encounter with his work, and it was strictly intellectual, right? Was a short book that he wrote. No, it wasn't even a book he wrote. It was a series of interviews, if I recall, that he did with Peter Seewald,
Yes.
who interviewed him often throughout his time as a cardinal, and then I think after as Pope as well. And it was interesting to hear him speak the way that he did during these interviews, because he stood apart from my immediate perception of what a pope was at that point in time. Because John Paul II was still pope. I'd always, and still to this day, turn more of a critical eye toward him. But he had a breadth of learning and just an unbelievable acumen. There's nothing he could not talk about, and talk about with authority, right? Which was very impressive, I thought.
Yeah, he was not BSing anybody.
No, and his conviction was rock solid. And that was just my initial impression of him, right? Now, we can talk like this about him, as much as we want, but we also understand as well that it was never quite enough for us to become Roman Catholic, though, right? He did not.
Yeah.
He didn't convince us of that, clearly. But at the same time, watching how he wrote after he became the Pope, it's interesting. He turned away from so many of the interests that he had academically and intellectually early on. And early on, he was something of a modernist. I mean, prior to and during the Vatican II days, he had modernist tendencies, to be sure. But as he grew more into his role as a cardinal and then later, of course, as a pope, it's almost that he had a resurgence of seriousness, right, about the the urgency.
Even by 69, when
Yeah.
he's still a theologian and priest, he had turned that corner.
Yeah, and he started writing on, I don't know if it was before he wrote the 3-volume work on Jesus of Nazareth, which itself is fantastic, but he also wrote some individual volumes on the Fathers of the Church, the Latin and Greek Fathers of the Church, which is excellent.
Yeah, they were.
It was really, really good. And the way he spoke about it was practically void of the usual language you're accustomed to hearing when Roman Catholics treat the fathers, right? They're fishing for stuff.
Yes.
He wasn't doing that.
No.
I mean, he wasn't doing any of that at all. He was almost too smart for that, right? And he was doing it as a pope, though, still, which is pretty remarkable. So I thought that was pretty amazing. And this 3-volume work on Jesus of Nazareth, which I just started going back to. I bought them when they came out, and I read them, and I had not read them for a long time. And in light of his passing, I started going back to it. And I'm beginning to recall, I'm seeing a part of it that I did not see before, which really is very interesting because him being an academic, and to the obvious extent that he was that, this is also a 3-volume redress against the excesses of the historical critical method.
Absolutely.
Yes. Oh,
Right?
yeah.
Especially the one on infancy narrative.
Yes, which is very clear if you know the historiography behind all this, right? You know who he's going after.
Yes.
He's going after Raymond Brown.
Right.
Right? So that's very interesting. And to hear someone, or to read someone write like this about this issue, right, who came from that, right? I mean,
In the German school.
the Germans created the historical critical method, right?
Yep.
And then, it's almost his crowning achievement, in my opinion, where even if he can go back and say, look, we need to be critical now of this method itself, right? And I think that's amazing.
Yeah, he doesn't dismiss it.
No, he doesn't.
But it reminds me of Aquinas in many ways, right? After, if you know, writes the Summa, he's like, it's just hay and stubble,
Yeah.
right? And that's, Aquinas wasn't impressed with his intelligence, and neither was Cardinal Ratzinger. Cory, I think your assessment is spot on. Spot on.
And he'll be missed.
He will. And I mean, I'll be honest with you. You and I had long conversations at your house about this, and almost an existential crisis at some points in my life. Had he remained Pope, I would have joined the Ordinariate.
Sure, yeah.
And we won't get into it. That's another whole podcast
Yeah.
about. I don't even believe this Pope wants us to join the Ordinariate. So
He may not even want. I don't think people are convinced that he wants it to even exist at this
Yeah.
point, right?
So,
I wouldn't blame you for not going because it might not be there.
But the balance to Pope Benedict is that even a saintly man, a holy man, isn't gifted in every area. He didn't want to be Pope.
Right.
He desperately didn't want to be Pope. He basically begged the cardinals, "Don't elect me." He was a scholar. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to retire. He tried to retire 3 times. At the doctrine of the faith, and John Paul's like, "No, I need you."
Yeah.
He did need him big time, right? And while he wasn't perfect, more than any other cleric in Catholicism, Ratzinger took on the sexual issues big time.
Yeah.
He got rid of 800 priests. It starts with him, and yet the critics lambaste him because of whatever case they can find. Like, without him, nothing would have happened. So
Right.
he's huge in that.
Yeah.
But he was not, by temperament, designed by God to try to control the curia.
No, it really wasn't for him.
It wasn't
No.
for him. It
No.
wasn't his skill set.
Right,
The people around him weren't as honest as him.
right.
Right? They have a different agenda. And
Yeah.
so he was not an administrative success, right? And we can't take that away. And I wrote that in my little section that I wrote for us in our congregation. So I readily admit that, right?
Yeah.
But saints don't have gifts in every single area. That's not, I think we can lose the magnificence and just the corpus of this guy's work can get lost if we get stuck
Yeah.
in that area of his papacy.
And he had a remarkable way of interacting with non-Catholics.
Yes.
Right. Being German, of course, gave him that edge, so to speak. Right, coming from the home of Luther. Right, Tübingen University and all these places, these centers of Protestant learning and history. He was able to strike up unbelievable friendships with
Big time.
folks, but he never compromised the Catholic position.
No.
Right? And that's not an easy thing to do for anybody from wherever it is they're coming from, right? And so I found that very remarkable. And the Protestants whom he interacted with, they loved him.
Absolutely.
They loved him. They appreciated his friendship.
The Lutheran bishop in Bavaria was like his best friend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty remarkable. And, in his relationship to, with the Eastern churches, not as pronounced as his predecessors, for obvious reasons. John Paul II came from Eastern Europe, so he had a closer affinity,
Right.
with the Eastern Church.
And Paul VI went and met
Yes,
the patriarch
of course,
in
yeah,
Jerusalem.
Athenagoras
Right.
and whatnot. So, not quite the same. But again, I think it's because Ratzinger, coming from Germany, he knew Protestantism very well. He knew it well, probably better than most Protestants.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
And so he knew what was good in it, and he knew what was bad in it. Right? And so I think that was a dear part of his work. Just as it was a part of John Paul II's work to reach out to, the Eastern Church. And, it was John Paul II who had said the church has to breathe with
Two lungs, yeah.
And,
Right.
and again, that is his position, right? But still, it's a different interest set, that both men had. But even then, there was nothing he could not talk about.
Well, in
wasn't.
2010, he went to England.
Yeah.
First state visit of a pope ever to
Right.
England. John Paul went in 82 to Canterbury Cathedral. Robert Runcie had invited him, but he was there as head of state, and he went to meet the head of state, the Queen, and they met in Balmoral. And it's one of the most moving things ever. Here's a kid drafted in the Hitler Youth, right? Ends up, as a prisoner of war at the end. Obviously, his family was utterly opposed to Nazism. And he goes to meet a woman almost exactly his age, within months of
Yeah.
each other, right?
Yeah.
Whose father was the King of England, right? Who's stood alone against Nazi tyranny. And you couldn't have a more iconic picture of what Christ is capable of doing
No.
than the German Pope going to see Elizabeth II as her guest at Balmoral, right? And that would have been incomprehensible in 1945, right? Just incomprehensible. And because he goes Westminster Abbey, they have an evensong state service, and then he prays side by side with Rowan Williams at the tomb of St. Edward the Confessor. But when Benedict came in, if you watch that, YouTube that, there's just a presence of this guy that just dwarfs anybody. What strikes me, he about that, if you watch it, Rowan Williams is in full mitre, and he's coming down side by side with the Pope, and he's blessing all of the crowd in Westminster, and Benedict's just walking with this kind of dignified, with his red shoes on. He's a little tight too.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Up there, and then they did all the mutual addresses and so forth. There was something just so apostolic about that guy, and then he addressed the joint session of the two houses of Commons and the Lords in Westminster Hall, within feet of where St. Thomas More was condemned to death. And again, it's like his different speeches he gave in Germany, those lectures on social politics, and
Yeah.
just brilliant, just absolutely brilliant. And he basically, the only way he could, that God's sovereign, natural law matters, and you pass bad laws, right? And there's nobody in England can counterpunch for that guy.
Oh, no.
Nobody.
In any context.
No.
Right.
And it's
Politically, ecclesiastically.
incredible.
Yeah.
Visit. Nobody else could have done it. Who else in history could have done that? And there's nobody coming in the pipeline who's going to be able to do it.
No.
do it either.
Yeah.
So,
It's interesting that they called him God's Rottweiler.
yeah.
Because we don't know him personally, but we know a great deal about his personality.
Oh, he's
and he was just
soft and gentle.
Just the opposite of a Rottweiler.
Absolutely.
The
Such a
president
misnomer.
incumbent is an absolute tyrant. In every way. Although he doesn't give you the impression of being a tyrant, right? And which is usually what the best tyrants do.
Well, you're right. When he was elected, wasn't the left, the Catholic media and the left we're going to have this dictator, and
Yeah.
he's going to be this, horrible experience. He was
Yeah.
anything but that,
Right.
as the Pope,
Yeah.
right? Was incredibly charitable,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't persecute his enemies. He didn't exclude them from positions of post. Maybe he should have been more
Right,
diligent
yeah,
in that.
yeah.
The current Pope, if you're not in the right lane, you're getting nothing.
Right.
Right? So,
Or the left lane.
yeah.
So to speak, yeah.
Right?
And that whole distorted response comes down to another defining part of Ratzinger's ministry and his personality was that he was so willing and bold to speak the truth and defend Christian morality to a hostile world. He wasn't afraid to point to something and say, hey, this is wrong. You need to stop doing that.
Yeah, well, Cory's point, that he never compromised the Catholic position. Not to Protestants, even with Anglicanism, right? He would, its closest relative in the West, but he makes this tremendous gesture, but it's still on the church's terms, right? But he also didn't compromise with Judaism or Islam.
No.
Right.
And especially the Islamic issue, he
Well, yeah, you go
was
back
just
to his-
butchered internationally.
Yeah, the Regensburg Address.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is, I remember seeing that, and because my own perceptions of Catholicism at that point in time were pretty low, especially surrounding a lot the recent history of the interreligious dialogue and just the constant surrendering,
The kissing of the Quran and all
that stuff with John Paul II, and and even before that, right? And so here he goes to Regensburg, and he gives this address, and in the most eloquent and intelligent way that anyone could say it, basically says the Quran is just a bunch of nonsense, right? Like, wow.
And he literally said that it can't be divine.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
right, and so I was like, wow, that takes guts,
Right.
lots of guts.
There's not a single Protestant prelate on earth who would say that.
No.
Not one. And 90% of Catholic bishops wouldn't say it either.
No, they wouldn't, or priests. And, the other thing, too, that's great about him, too, and this part gets, maybe neglected a bit, but his defense of just Christendom, his defense of Christian Europe, right, and going after the EU, which you could argue is probably a greater threat to the West than Islam or anything else, right, is globalization.
Oh, yes, sure.
And he was calling that out long, long time ago. And he was saying, you cannot fix the problems of Europe, right, just through secular globalization. It's not going to happen. You have to remember that Europe is definitively Christian. It is a Christian civilization. And if you throw that out, you have nothing. You have nothing. But he was ever so subtle about it, right, when he would talk about it. And a lot of people thought he was insensitive and whatnot, but the proof is in the pudding now. I mean, Europe is a disaster.
All truth
So-
tellers are insensitive.
Yeah, right.
Well, and of course, history is just going to prove Benedict right. His prophecy, I don't like that word, but in the sense, what he said in 69 about the future of the church is absolutely Right,
It
right.
is, sure.
He's like,
For our listeners who might not be familiar with what he said in 69, do you want to
yeah, he
summarize
was,
that?
it was, the end of the Vatican Council, and as Cory talked about, he had made this turn, kind of being a satellite of Hans Kung, and he just went back to the right, went back to his Bavarian roots, and he was, a year and a half, 2 years into that, and he said the church is going to go through great upheaval from now on, and eventually she's going to be downsized, priests and bishops will lose their faith, but she will become a remnant people, she'll lose her great structures, basically she'll go back to the catacombs. And it's absolutely what's happening, and we're not even close to bottoming out. We're not even close to bottoming out.
Oh, no,
yet.
no.
It's going to go on for another 100 years.
Yeah.
And, but he saw it in the late 60s, and he saw the takeover, secular takeover of Christian Europe.
Yeah.
And Germany won't even exist. There won't be any Caucasians in Germany in 20 years.
Yeah. Well, you were there not that long ago. You said the Brandenburg Gate basically looked like a Middle East street market.
Oh, it was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. And so all of Europe, England the same way,
Yeah.
right? It's like, they said, it just baffles me. They yak on about all of this stuff, and it's like they don't even reproduce. It's like,
You got to have kids.
you got to have kids.
I was reading this article here. This is an article, Benedict XVI, ecumenical dialogue with the Eastern Orthodox Church. It was a nice piece, I thought. And it quotes Ratzinger at the end, and he says, what kind of civilization should this be? And he's referring to the budding European Union. Should it be one of life, love, one that defends human life from conception to natural death? Or will it be a civilization of death, abortion, contempt for the marriage between man and women, and for traditional family euthanasia, hatred of religion? Would it be a culture that respects Europe's Christian past, which shaped the continent's identity, ethnic minorities, the poor, the sick, and the elderly? Or will it have a culture that protects only sexual minorities while destroying cultural works and proclaiming relativism and hedonism? What values would unite a disunited Europe? And what would these values include? Would they include faith in God, the Creator, the Savior of mankind, the value of human dignity, or the values of the French and Bolshevik revolutions that mercilessly took countless lives in the values of Marxist class struggle?
Wow.
But
There's that whole speaking in a paragraph, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
ability
Yeah.
to, when did he write that?
this is
He
from...
was a cardinal then?
Yes, he was then visiting, he was having a meeting with the Archbishop of Athens, Christodoulos, at the time, and this was 2007. So he was Pope.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and, like you said, wokeism didn't start in the last 5 years, but
Right.
every year it ramps up, it doubles. right?
exponentially.
Oh, yeah.
Right, so,
For 2 weeks.
so he's saying this 16 years ago.
Right.
Again, not that he was a prophet, but much
No.
of what he said was prophetic,
No.
and it was really just that he had his finger on the pulse of divine truth.
He was aware.
Yeah.
He was uniquely and insightfully aware of what was going on in the Western world more than most people. You don't have to be a prophet. You don't have to be touched by the finger of God to just see the sign of the times.
Just have to pay attention.
Right? But he saw it, and he tried to warn everyone.
Right.
And here we are. Right?
Here we are.
Here's the Western world.
And I think that brings us to the question that many are asking, especially our brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church, which is, what can we expect now from Pope Francis now that Benedict is gone? And I think as observers of the Catholic Church, maybe not experts by any means, we're a little more free to speculate, although we have to keep it charitable. But I was reading a New York Times article on the passing of Benedict, and
Sure, that was complimentary.
oh, it was so complimentary. But one of the people quoted was saying this, that some liberal supporters of Francis, who is often balked in the face of advancing major overhauls, are raising expectations for a late-breaking season of change. in
That
the
just sounds like
Catholic
a whole
Church.
lot of fluff. I mean, what does that mean? right? What does that mean?
Well, it's so totally in the style of Pope Francis, where everything is done in winks and
Right,
nods,
yes.
and all the
Code.
while you're working up this undercurrent of what feels like leftward change to a lot of the more conservative and traditional Roman Catholics.
Well, Francis is going to move, in a sense, to do this even more radical shift in Catholic doctrine and redefine the faith. He's going to have to do it in a hurry.
Yeah, he doesn't look well.
No, he's feeble. He's 86 himself, so or it'll be his minions. The College of Cardinals is stacked now. He's appointed more than half the electors. So the fact is, the Catholic Church is in de facto schism already. The German Catholic Church is utterly heretical. It defies. It's already doing same-sex marriages. It's just a matter of time. It's either going to underground or overtly ordain women, right? It's denying basic tenets of the faith, and the thing is, there's no pushback at all. What are they waiting for? How off the rails do you have to get, right? Literally, Cory, the German Lutheran Church isn't any different than the Episcopal Church in 1995.
Sure.
Right? And we know how this ends, right?
Yeah.
It's just a train wreck. And that's what's going to happen, right? And that's just going to lead to other ethnic churches to do this, parts of Catholicism to do the same thing, right? And so...
Just as an aside, I always laugh when I hear about the Synod of Synodality. It's like a committee on committees.
That's not a redundancy. I don't know what is.
But that I think that sums up this whole,
Right.
And Pell really laid that out right before his last opus before he died. Is like, this thing's the worst thing ever. In my 81 years, it's the worst thing I've ever seen come.
Yeah.
First document, he said, the working document is the worst thing ever produced by the Vatican, and I would absolutely agree.
Yeah.
It's just
Just to interrupt there, for anyone who's interested in learning more about what we're talking about with Cardinal Pell, Pints with Aquinas has an excellent video
Yes.
that recaps some of how he encountered Cardinal Pell before the end of his life, and it was quite eye-opening for me. Learned a lot.
I think it goes back, the thing that we have to keep our eye, right? We're not experts. I don't know who is, but really, we're not experts on what's going on inside the Curia. But as you said last week, it's important that the Roman Church is the largest Catholic church, the largest Christian church on earth. It has direct influence on every other branch of Christianity, whether we like it or not, right? Its shadow is the heaviest. And the changes will be cataclysmic. I don't know exactly how these dominoes are going to fall, but I know this, and I know it from the Anglican experiment. Once you let something out of the bottle, you never can put it back in. So no toothpaste in Germany is going back in the tube.
Yeah.
And anybody who thinks that is an idiot, naive, and a fool. It's not going to happen. They're not going to go through this. They're already there. And all of a sudden they're going to reverse, because even if you get a, quote, conservative traditionalist pope, they're just going to ignore that.
Right.
That's what's going to happen. The other thing is
Yeah.
Germany has moolah up the wazoo,
Sure.
because
the richest country in
the
Europe.
government pays the
Yeah,
church.
right.
So they have billions of dollars, right? They don't have any people, but they have all kinds of money. And so
We may not have heat pretty soon
filthy
either.
lacra, filthy lacra, the
All
Vatican,
sorts of bad decisions in there.
without a Benedict or a Pell, who's going to discipline the Germans and then sacrifice all the money? They send more money to the Vatican. They probably send twice as much as the rest of Europe. So there's all of these other intrigues that go into this thing, and how,
That relationship, I mean, that goes all the way back to Charlemagne,
yes,
right? So
absolutely. It's
how do you sever that? You don't.
well, only a person of uncompromising conviction.
Yeah. I'm willing to take a risk.
right? It would take, similar to, and it's more complicated than this, but it's similar to John Paul II and Reagan and Thatcher staring down the Soviets, right? That's what it'll take.
Yeah.
But those people only come along once 100 years, if you're lucky,
Yeah.
right? And
Yep.
they're not around right now.
No.
Around the Tiber, they're not around.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think, Rector? Where do you see this stuff from your perspective, your generation?
I don't know how many of my generation paid all that close attention to Pope Benedict. I'm sure there are many, and I'm sure that we paid closer attention to him than some others just because of his great prominence. But when I think of the passing of Pope Benedict, I think of it in much the same way that we had our conversation about Queen Elizabeth, where he was the last and preeminent Orthodox churchman, as you said in your article on Holy Communion, and of the greatest generation, by the way. And like Queen Elizabeth before him, I think his death symbolizes the twilight of Western civilization. And we need to really stop and pay attention to this as a signpost along the way in order to appreciate its true significance. And if nothing else, we have to realize how rare it is for men like him to come around who are bold and willing to stand on the courage of their convictions, no matter what the cost.
Yeah. I mean, you think about God's sovereignty. In God's sovereignty, Elizabeth was born 6 months before this guy was born in Bavaria, right? And they literally are the definitive icons of the end of the greatest generation, from the role of the state and the role of the church in theology. And neither one has a peer in their expertise and her ability to be a constitutional monarch in the modern world was, as we've said in our conversation, was astounding. And his theological acumen just doesn't have parallel. So, and they're both gone. And that's just that's a void of anybody who is self-conscious of what's important in Western civilization that can't be filled.
Yeah.
My hope, and I think the great thing about Ratzinger's towering intellect, is that his works are going to survive him long after even the common memory of him is gone. I think many have said that people may be reading his homilies in the same way that we read homilies of the church fathers. If nothing else, I think books like these are going to have a very, very long shelf life,
Sure.
to use that phrase. But
As long as they're not banned.
as long as they don't get banned, of course.
Of course, we laugh about that. That actually will be good. That'll make them more popular.
Yeah, well,
generally what
that'll,
happens.
That'll keep them even more in circulation in Orthodox Christian circles. So,
As you both know, I work and teach in a Catholic school, and I think I told you this privately. A couple of weeks back, we were talking with one of my classes about abortion, right? The catalyst being conscience, because we were reading A Man for All Seasons, and there wasn't a single student in my class who would have taken a chance to argue for being against abortion. All the students, men, women, both.
how many kids altogether?
In this class, 12. Now, this is the highest grade in the school. It's the 8th grade, right? So you have to consider they've been in this school for what?
13 years?
13 years now, almost.
No, 9 years.
9 years, right?
Yeah.
K through 8, right? What happened?
I said-
What got lost in translation? I don't understand.
When we were texting back and forth, when you told me that, I'm thinking, even by chance, natural law would hit one child.
No.
Not one.
Not if it's not taught, not if it's not allowed.
And if it's not
Right.
reinforced at home at all.
Well, that's the other issue too, right? So, no, it's not good. Those are bad optics.
What's left of parochial schools in Rhode Island, right? You're one of the healthiest ones, and it's tiny, right? Has no cause and effect. You can learn to read and write at least theoretically, anyway.
We hope.
Right? But you can't, you're supposed to learn
Basketball,
about
not today.
Christ in a parochial school,
Right.
but they don't.
No.
Right? The parents don't know Christ. I don't know what the pastors have been doing with that school for the last 40 years, but
Yeah.
you teach in a parochial school. I mean, the most prestigious Catholic high schools in this state are prep schools.
Yeah.
They're not, they might have to take some religion, I understand that, but
And walk away with something, but
it's not why people send their kids to those schools.
not anymore.
And
Sports.
we're fooling ourselves to think otherwise. It's
Right.
sports, it's the fact that 99% of them get placement at major universities.
Yep.
Right? And they're the cream of the crop academically of all the kids in Rhode Island.
It's about status.
Yeah, and
It's about status.
again, it's just putting your head in the sand to think otherwise.
Right.
That this isn't what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's not to say they're not great schools. They are great schools from a secular perspective.
Sure. Especially when you compare them to the opposite.
Right.
Right? The
Right.
alternative.
Because they don't have any of the drag, academic drag, with any public school has to deal with. They're just all gifted people
Yeah.
that go there, right?
Yeah.
But they don't produce vocations. They don't. So the very things that parochial schools should do,
Right.
they don't do.
You know, this is just a side thing, but, being parochial schools, they of course have worship for the students and the faculty, at least once a week, right? Some of them, the more traditionally minded ones, will try to do it every day. In the school that I'm at, I have yet, no, maybe a couple of times I've seen it, but overwhelmingly, it's always girls serving at the altar with the priest. How in the world are you going to fix what we've been hearing for years from Roman Catholics in the Roman Catholic Church is a crisis in vocations when you're not using the best context you have to train future clergy? And it's girls. I don't get it. I just don't get it.
Because it's interpreted.
Boggles my mind.
Interpreted by a boy who still has a sense of being masculine. It's a girly act.
Yeah.
If he has no men
Right?
in his life doing that as an example, then
Right.
he's not going to see that as a masculine
Right.
thing. So we're just about out of time here. I think we could talk about it for a long time, but I think like what you were saying, Cory, goes back to what we said at the start of the episode with regard to the great tradition, that as soon as you start to lose your obedience to your creeds and to what your tradition affirms, then you really don't have a future. Things go off the rail really fast.
Without first principles, you are nothing.
Nothing. You've got nothing
Nothing.
outside of that.
Nothing.
And for thinking, listening Christians to understand is that sin abounds both inside and outside of the church, even in churches of the great tradition. So we just need to be clear-eyed about that and put our faith in Christ and in the proclamation of the
Yeah,
gospel.
why people are surprised by that always is again, just naivete. Judas was an apostle, right? So it goes back to the beginning,
It's
right?
nothing new.
There's a wheat and there's tares. And so that's not what should overwhelm us, right? What we don't give in to the tares. We don't let the tares become the rulers.
Right.
And that's what's happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for having this conversation today. It was great as always. Definitely, we should pray for men of vocation. We pray for each other. We pray for our listeners as well, and we kindly ask for your prayers. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, please, if you haven't already, subscribe to us on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. Leave a 5-star rating and leave a comment on YouTube too, but only positive ones. We love to hear what you're doing, and we appreciate those who have provided feedback so far. So with that, we look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.
Thank you.